Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. My name is Jeff Short, and today we're going to be looking at a sort of a review of a video that I put out on another channel, Christian Answers. This channel, Christ and Culture, a parallel channel. We're going to be analyzing some of the comments that came in on a video I did on John MacArthur, Pastor John MacArthur's view of the Revolutionary War. Now, I don't know if you understand or know, some of you who haven't been following this discussion, Pastor John MacArthur was on the Ben Shapiro show, Sunday special, and he was asked by Ben Shapiro, what do you think about the Revolutionary War? Is that justified by Christian teachings? And John MacArthur said, without blinking an eye, he says, Christians never revolt against government, and that the Revolutionary War was unjustified. It was a violation of Romans 13 that says that we are to be subject to all ruling authorities. And so he says that, according to John MacArthur, that the Revolutionary War was unjustified and Christians should not have supported it. Now, some of the comments that I got for that video were defending John MacArthur's position against any alternative position. And I said very carefully in the video that I made that I think it's an open question as to whether the Revolutionary War is justified under Christian biblical principles. I think an argument can be made on both sides, in other words. So I didn't come down clearly on one side or the other, because I believe that there needs to be a lot more discussion, there needs to be a lot more argumentation given before you just jump to the conclusion. Now, one of the problems that I had with John MacArthur's answer to Ben Shapiro is that he basically gave his conclusion without really supporting it. And that's what needs to be done. There needs to be a discussion, there needs to be a justification, there needs to be an explanation as to why Romans 13 would argue against Christians revolting, or in the case of the Revolutionary War, Romans 13 would be an argument against Revolutionary War. There needs to be an explanation as to why that is the case. There wasn't. It was just stated, Christians don't revolt against government. Bam, done, over. Well, Romans 13 does argue that we are to be subject to those who are in ruling authority over us, but does that mean in all instances we're to be subject and under the authority and to not go against the authorities that rule over us? Does that mean in every instance, in every single case? Seems like there's an inconsistency here. So let's look at some of the comments that I generated from that video on my other channel, Christian Answers, and let's talk about them. Well, the first comment that came in from Kyle Manning, I pretty much dismissed this because I didn't feel that it had any justification. He says, with John's type of mindset, I wouldn't be able to have the same rights and freedoms that he has. And it looks like Kyle is a black man, and he's saying that John MacArthur's mindset, he wouldn't be free of slavery. And I wrote, I'm not sure that's true. Remember, England was the first major country to outlaw the slave trade. So the irony is, if we had lost to the English in the Revolutionary War, slavery in the colonies might have ended sooner. Of course, that's speculation. So think about that. If we had lost to England in the Revolutionary War and the colonies had remained English colonies, slavery might have ended sooner because, as we all know, slavery ended in England before it ended in the United States. So that's something we'll never know, and it's all speculation, but it gets you thinking about the issue nevertheless. I don't think that John MacArthur's position would necessarily rule out the ending of slavery, but this commenter thought it might have. Okay, here's the heart of the objection that some of the comments were from a Gary Kissinger, He says, your reply in this video wasn't thought through very well. And I will give you a couple of reasons illustrating why. The first and foremost was your point about the tyrannical ruler. Who was the ruler over Paul and his fellow Christians when he recorded the scripture in AD 57? It was Nero, who was a brutal, tyrannical dictator who routinely tortured and murdered Christians during Paul's day. Just 5 years after Paul recorded those verses in Romans, Nero blamed the Christians for the fires of Rome that he himself ordered to be set. The Christians he blamed for those fires were tortured and put to death. So your point about Christians revolting when they are under tyrannical rule doesn't hold up, because Paul and his fellow Christians were under a brutal tyranny when he recorded those verses. Okay. Now, what I want to say to Gary here is, what do you think Nero, being the emperor of the Roman Empire at the time of Paul and the early Christians, what do you think that means? Because you seem to be saying that because Paul said that Christians are to be subject to the ruling authorities, and because Nero was the ultimate ruling authority in the Roman Empire, that Christians are to be subject to every type of ruling authority, because the very worst of ruling authorities was ruling when Paul wrote that scripture. Now, are you trying to say that Paul's command in Romans 13 is an absolute command, and that we are to be subject to every single decree of every single ruling authority, even under the worst ruling authorities? Is that what you're trying to say? We'll come back to that. Okay, secondly, I'm going to quote Gary here. Secondly, your point about the apostles going against government authority by preaching the gospel also doesn't hold up. Those same apostles were willing to be imprisoned and put to death by the government authority for preaching the gospel. In fact, many of them were imprisoned and put to death by their government for preaching the gospel. So they submitted themselves to the rule of their government, even unto death. The main point of my reply is that tyranny or tyrannical dictatorship doesn't carry any weight in your reply, because Paul and his fellow Christians were under the brutality of tyranny when he recorded those verses in Romans. That's interesting that Gary says that they submitted themselves to imprisonment and death. I thought they were imprisoned and put to death because they didn't submit to the government decree. If you're historically aware, you'll realize that at one point Christians were allowed to go free if they submitted to the emperor's desire that they submit a sacrifice to the emperor, or if they pledged their loyalty to the emperor, which was the decree. Every citizen, whatever their religion, had to submit to the spiritual authority of the emperor, and they had to submit that by sacrificing to the emperor. And the reason Christians went to prison and were tortured and were killed is because they didn't submit to the emperor. So which is it? Did they submit to the emperor? Did they submit to the ruling authority? If they had submitted to the ruling authority, then they wouldn't be in prison. They wouldn't have died. They wouldn't have been tortured. The point is, they didn't submit to the ruling authority, and they were punished for that. Now, is that a violation of Romans 13? Paul says, submit yourselves to all ruling authorities, for they are God's ministers for justice. So it seems like the early Christians didn't follow Paul's command in all instances, or else they would never have faced any persecution, because they would have simply sacrificed to the emperor. They would have done whatever the emperor said, because that's what submission to the emperor would be. If the emperor says to bow down before him and you don't resist that, but you submit to that, then you will bow down to the emperor. Well, clearly Paul wasn't saying that. So what that means is there are exceptions. Paul's command in Romans 13 to submit to the authorities doesn't mean in an absolute sense. Gary's point here that the disciples didn't submit to the Jewish ruling authorities, he says that doesn't violate the principle Paul lays down. Well, it does a little bit. It does in the very strict literal sense, because if those disciples had submitted to the ruling authority in Jerusalem, which included the high priests, which included the Jewish authorities, if they had submitted in an absolute, strict literal sense, they would have not preached the gospel, because the Jews at that time were the authority in Jerusalem. Now, they worked under the authority of the Roman Empire, of course, but a lot of the administration of the law was done within the Jewish community by Jews who were under the authority of the Roman emperor. So when the disciples kept on preaching Jesus Christ, and when they told the Jewish authorities, judge for yourselves whether to obey God or to obey man. As for us, we will continue to preach the gospel. They were violating the ruling authority over them. They weren't violating the top ruling authority. They weren't violating Nero. Nero probably didn't even know about the disciples, but they were violating one of the authorities over them, and they did so out of obedience to God and the higher authority. So Romans 13, the command by Paul to submit yourselves to the ruling authorities, is not an absolute command. There are exceptions. And so what Gary is saying is that one of the exceptions could be whenever the law of man violates the law of God. Okay, so we admit now that there are exceptions, that there are times when we don't submit ourselves to the ruling authorities. Now, saying that, well, they were put to death and put in jail, and that's submitting to the authorities. Well, they weren't given a choice, because when you're arrested and you're put in jail, you're not submitting to the ruling authorities. They are grabbing you and throwing you in jail, and they're grabbing you and putting you to death. It's not like you're submitting, because if you had submitted to their commands, you wouldn't even be in jail and you wouldn't be put to death. So yes, there's disobedience to authority. There's no question about it. And the early church was willing, in their preaching and teaching of Jesus Christ, to disobey the ruling authorities, whether it was Jewish or whether it was Roman. They were willing to disobey that ruling authority. So that was my point. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that there are exceptions to Paul's command in Romans 13. And that's what I said to Gary in my reply. It says, it's more complicated than you portray it. Do your homework, read, put in the time, then make an argument. If you think it's a simple question, it's because you are simplifying it for your own sake, for your own mental comfort. John MacArthur simplifies it too. I intend to do a second video on this subject and get into more detail. And I do intend to do another video and get actually into more of the detailed arguments. Now, Gary said to me in reply, I did do my homework, you didn't do yours. Refute the factual points that I made in my reply. An ad hominem reply is no reply at all. Well, stop right there. I didn't make an ad hominem reply. I didn't attack Gary. I didn't call him a name. I didn't say bad things about him. I said that he is not grasping the complexity of this issue. I said that he needs to do more reading. He needs to look into this issue more. What Gary is doing is giving conclusions. And he's throwing out a few little points, but he's not making an argument. He is basically sharing his conclusions, just like John MacArthur did. Now, John MacArthur and Gary might be right. They actually might be arguing for what ultimately will be shown and demonstrated to be the correct answer. It could be that, for example, John Wesley, at the time of the Revolutionary War, who wrote from England to the colonists and said, don't go to war, it's not scriptural, it's against the Bible, you don't have authority to revolt against the ruling authorities, and he quoted Romans 13. It could be that John Wesley is correct in this instance. John Wesley isn't always correct in all of his commentaries, but he could be correct, along with John MacArthur could be correct. But that has to be developed. That argument has to be made. Gary has not made his argument in his comments. He needs to unpack. For example, he makes the statement about Nero. Nero was the worst ruler, and Paul said that we need to submit to all authorities. Okay, well, unpack that. What do you mean? It's not enough to just state your conclusions. Now, possibly John MacArthur on the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special didn't have time to get into it, but he didn't even try. He didn't even try to unpack Romans 13 and talk about some of the exceptions and so forth. He just basically just said, point blank, Christians never revolt against government. And I think that that needs to be actually developed. And I think that that argument needs to be made. But until it's made, it's just someone's conclusion. And it doesn't really get us there. Here's another comment from A.O. It says, on your point about the apostles preaching the gospel in Acts 5, MacArthur, in the very video with Ben Shapiro, he says that Christians do dissent from the commands to disobey, preaching the gospel. They do go against the commands of a government that tell people not to preach the gospel, attend church, live rightly. That does not mean we revolt against the government. In that case, you don't rebel, you go to jail. That was John MacArthur's point. Okay, my point was, once you admit that there are exceptions to Romans 13, that it's not an absolute command of God to never disobey the Roman ruling authority, then you are entering into a argument and a discussion as to the extent and limits of those exceptions, and what the people who were Christians, who were ministers, actually John Witherspoon among others, were arguing at the time of the Revolutionary War is that the Revolutionary War did not violate Romans 13, and that it was one of those exceptions where when you had a tyrannical government and you had the possibility of actually correcting the tyranny. For example, if you look at the just war theory, the theory and the thinking about how Christians are to approach the whole topic of war. Should Christians fight in a war? And you have to look at the circumstances, and you have to also, one of the points of a just war theory would be you have to have the reasonable outcome of possibly winning. You can't justify fighting a war that doesn't have the possibility of winning. For example, Christians under the Soviet Union, at the height of the Soviet Union, when Christians were huddled in homes, and being a Christian and educating your child was illegal in Christianity under the Soviet Union, communist nation, it would have been futile. It would have been foolish for Christians to say, hey, let's overthrow the tyranny here and do a just government. No, that would have been futile. But if you have a situation, for example, like the colonists had, where they were already self-governing. They had an authority. They had a ruling authority. Every colony had its own government. Every town had its own mayor. There was a structure of governing authority already in place at the time of the colonial period in our country. And so citizens were submitting to their authorities and to their governments. But they were beginning to feel, and actually Britain was beginning to impose a tyrannical, almost like a foreign government upon the colonists. And so the colonists actually saw this taking up arms and fighting was almost like an invading army was coming in, and in self-defense they had to defend their own government against this tyrannical government in the form of the king. So a lot has to be done before you get to the conclusion, oh, we shouldn't have ever fought the Revolutionary War, it violates Romans 13. No, not necessarily. It might have violated Romans 13, but you have to make an argument that it does. And it's not enough to just say, there's Romans 13. No, and you have to unpack it. You have to, because it's more complex. And that's what I argued at the very beginning of when I tackled this issue. It is a complicated issue. It has to be thought through, and it's not enough to just quote a verse and go, see, that's it. No. We need to hear both sides. We need to listen, and we need to try to discern. I write, here's what I replied. When the early Christians began, they were a small minority group in a big Roman Empire. It would have been utterly foolish for any Christian at that time to even think of resisting violently or non-violently the Roman Empire. It makes perfect sense that Paul would tell Christians to submit to the ruling authorities as a general principle. But what happens later if Christians become a sizable or majority religion in the empire? It's different. God never commanded the Jews in the Old Testament to adhere to a strict code of nonviolence. Do you think the New Testament teaches a strict code of nonviolence? Should Christians all be pacifists? Should we all be Amish? The early Christians refused to join the Roman army, so does that mean no Christians should join the army today? The question is complicated and requires thinking through a lot of factors, including just war theory and other difficult issues. It's not as simple as John MacArthur makes it, saying Christians never revolt. You could just as easily say Christians never go to war. Christians never fight in war, because Christ said to turn the other cheek. So you have to think through a little bit more than what John MacArthur stated in the Sunday special and what Gary here seems to be arguing. I think he might have the beginnings of an argument, but he has to develop it. He has to show us. Okay, here's another. Brian Bivens says, I do agree with you if John MacArthur meant never, but I don't think he meant when it comes to the gospel. He has made videos saying he would not bow down to things like gay marriage, but I could be wrong. And if John MacArthur meant never, then he is wrong. I think he should have been much more clear on many things with that interview. I would like to ask him about it, but I really think he meant more along the lines of just fighting the government because you don't like the president. I've also heard John MacArthur say that Christians should not protest. They shouldn't go out there with picket signs and protest a business or whatever. Again, that's a conclusion. How did he get to that? Let's hear his argument. Let's hear his reasoning. Let's have him spell out the case. He didn't do that. So it's really hard to say either way if he's correct or not, because he didn't present an argument. And my reply was, I think he was speaking to Christians taking up arms against their government the way the colonists took up arms against Britain. I wonder if MacArthur is fully informed about the whole discussion. It's not as simple as he makes it. Christians are to submit to the ruling authorities. Yes, generally speaking, but there are exceptions. Does he acknowledge exceptions? If so, what are the exceptional cases? So it's a bigger discussion that doesn't look like he's prepared to discuss in detail. It would be a good topic for Christians to debate with two fully informed Christian intellectuals presenting both sides. So what I want to say is I'm open to both arguments, and I want to hear what the best arguments on both sides are. Should the Christians at the time of the Revolutionary War taken up arms and fought against Britain? Or should they have abstained from that war and said, no, we can't fight against Britain because it's the overall ruling authority for us, and it says in Romans 13, submit yourselves to all ruling authorities because they're ministers of God for justice. It's not simply a matter of quoting Romans 13. It has to be unpacked. It has to be weighed against other factors. We know that Romans 13 has exceptions. We know that the apostles violated Romans 13 in its strict absolute sense when they went ahead and preached the gospel, even though they were commanded by the ruling authorities not to. And Rome, in fact, commanded Christians to sacrifice to Caesar, and Romans said no. The Christians said, no, we will not. We will violate your command. And they went to jail, and some of them died. So there are exceptions. What are those exceptions? And does one of those exceptions include defending your own household or property or town or city or territory with guns against someone, some power, even government, that wants to take over and tell you what to do? So that's a good question. It's an open question. We're still talking about it. Hope you join in next time. We'll talk more about it. This is Jeff Short, Christ in Culture. God bless.